World on Channel 404. A report released by the National Adoption Coalition of South Africa says there has been a steep decline in the number of adoptions in the country in the past 9 years. The report found that only 1,699 adoptions took place in 2013, a decrease from the 2,840 in 2004. This report is by Cindy Swadlali.
The research was released by the National Adoption Coalition of South Africa ahead of Child Protection Week and was based on the review of the Registry of Adoptable Children and Parents from November 2013. Statistics on child abandonment found that Child Welfare SA estimated that more than 3,500 babies were abandoned in 2010. There are 18.5 million children in South Africa, and of these, 4.5 million live with neither of their parents. Most of the research was conducted in the townships of Alexander, Soweto and Tembisa. Most parents who wanted to adopt sought a child of their own race, and girls were preferred to boys, where gender was specified. A concerning component showed that 60% of the children that had been abandoned, of these, less than 40% were formally consented for adoption by parents or family. In 2013, over 11 million children were registered for child support grants and over 500,000 children for foster care grants. With the numbers slowly declining, child abandonment is becoming an issue South Africans cannot ignore.
For more on the story, we are now joined in studio by Dee Blackie of the National Adoption Coalition of South Africa, as well as adoptive parents Dr. Kelly Gillespie and Leanne Naidu. Welcome to the show, ladies.
Thank you so much for having us.
Now, Doctor, just to start with you, Dee, what prompted the survey?
Well, I guess what we were seeing was that we know that the number of orphans in this country is increasing significantly year on year. We also know that abandonments are also increasing. So essentially our child protection crisis is worsening. And the one solution for many of these children, especially children who've been abandoned and who do not know who their biological parents are, so they can't be taken in by their extended family, is of course the option of adoption. And unfortunately what we're seeing is that adoption has declined significantly over the past, supposedly 9 years, but especially since 2010, since the implementation of the new Children's Act.
Now, taking a look at your survey, it says that there's been a 30% increase in the number of orphans in the country. Can you just take us through some of the reasons why?
Well, obviously one of the major impacts on orphans in this country is our HIV and AIDS pandemic. That's had a huge impact on the number of orphans in this country. And as I say, one of our major challenges is not the fact that not necessarily orphans, because orphans often get taken. South Africans adopt children every day within their family, so they take children in within their family, and a sister dies, a brother dies, a family member dies, and family members will rally to the cause, and they'll actually take that children into their home and take care of that child. The problem is that we're also seeing an increase in child abandonment, and that's a real problem, because if we consider that in 2010 there were 3,500 children abandoned on estimate, and most child protection organizations will tell you that number has increased, then we've got an excess of up to nearly 4,000 children being abandoned and only 1,500 being adopted on an annual basis. So the problem is really getting worse, and the solution is declining as well. So it's a worsening problem, and we know that all of our child protection organizations are under an enormous amount of pressure. Children's homes are at capacity. Our foster care system is really under pressure, and so we really do need to find a long-term solution, and adoption is that solution. So I guess what we were asking ourselves was, why are people not adopting children, and why are people also not choosing, why are they choosing abandonment as opposed to placing their child up for adoption? And that was what my research explored. Many people cite the new legislation, but actually the legislation is a good piece of legislation. And if people were using that as a tool to facilitate adoption, we wouldn't have a problem. But it appears that it's actually being used as a tool to prevent adoption, and that's what we needed to understand.
Now, you mentioned the foster care process, and I think for most people, the only time they do see the foster care process is on TV and in movies. What's the reality of the foster care process in South Africa?
Well, foster care is really a temporary solution for children. Foster care is if parents are having difficulty taking care of their child, they're given a safety line by the state, which is foster care. A child should really only be in foster care for the period of 2 years. And then they really should either be placed back into the care of their parents, should that process be possible, or they should be made available for adoption. The problem is in South Africa, what we see is children actually sitting in foster care for up until the age of 18. So their whole lives they're sitting in foster care. Now what that means for the child is that they never belong to the family, they never have a sense of belonging, they never have a sense of clear identity as to who they are and where they belong. And that's a huge challenge for the children. So it's not ideal. It's essentially making children grow up in a temporary situation, which is really difficult for them.
Now, your survey states that there are around 297 unmatched parents. So why are they unmatched? I mean, if there's so many children that are abandoned or so many children in the process of that are subjected to foster parents, why do you have unmatched parents? Because it seems like they do want to be matched to kids and they do want to adopt.
Sure. So that's a review of the Registry of Adoptable Children and Parents, which actually as a list of children available for adoption is not ideal because it's not accurate. There are way more children available for adoption. But essentially what that lists is that there are in excess of around about just under 300 parents wanting to adopt, and there are around about just over 400 children awaiting adoption. And what we're seeing is that the majority of the parents wanting to adopt are in fact white parents, and the majority of children available for adoption are in fact black children.
Kids,
yeah. And when it comes to adoption is a very challenging process for any parent. There are some wonderful parents who adopt. They just say, we want a child, and we'll take any child, doesn't matter what they look like. But it is a challenging process, and what we try to do is minimize the challenges that the child has to deal with. So essentially, what many parents will say is, I would like the child to look as much like me as possible. And so what you're seeing is many of those parents are saying, I want a child who looks like me, whether that be a white child or a black child. And of course, most of the parents wanting to adopt are white. Sadly, the majority of children available for adoption are black, and we have practically no black parents sitting on the Registry of Adoptable Children and Parents.
That's interesting. Now let's move on to the adoptive parents. Kelly, can you just take us through what prompted you to adopt?
Well, it was an interesting process. Leanne and I had been together about 6 years, and we decided that we wanted to start a family together. And initially we thought, well, what would be at stake for us to have biological children? And we went through various ideas about maybe I should be pregnant first, and then maybe Leanne should be pregnant. Where would we get sperm from? How is it going to work? And then we came across this really remarkable statistic, which was the number of children in this country that need homes. And it was, when we heard that statistic, it became a no-brainer for us, because what adoption offers is a win-win situation, literally. We wanted a child. There are thousands of children that need homes. Adoption facilitates both, right?
So
and
true.
there's when we thought about the effort and the expense of producing a biological child for ourselves versus the number of, and not even the expense, the ethics of producing a child for a world, when there are in that world children that desperately need homes, it became a very clear.
And our first step was to speak to our parents about this, and we were quite surprised. And I'm imagining that parents out there, when they first are approached about adoption, there is some kind of not shock, but it's not something that people think of ordinarily. And this is what we should be working towards, is encouraging people to think about this as a first option before considering reproducing oneself. So when you think of a family, we should be encouraging people to think about adoption. Both our mothers actually immediately said to us that they'd prefer us to carry our own children. And we had to then push them a bit further and say, but what is that about? So I think for us, it was a process. We didn't come immediately to it, but once someone had mentioned it to us and we did our research, it became much more clear that it made sense that was the option to choose.
Now, just speaking of some of the challenges, you're a same-sex couple. Can you just take me through, Leanne, some of the challenges that you faced throughout the adoption process?
Well, I would say parenting is much harder than adoption. And I think any parent would agree with that. So, I mean, while I hear that there are bureaucratic hurdles that one has to jump over, for me, the hard parts were some of the funny questions around what do you expect your child to look like. The form asks you, like, to describe your parents, to try and track something of a look that your family could reproduce. That was really strange for us. We come from different families that look differently, and so it was this weird thing of having to. So that process was a bit strange, but we had a social worker who worked with us. It took us in total about a year to get it completed. But for me, actually, it was not that cumbersome. What became cumbersome was more of the bureaucratic stuff that was put, how to get someone registered and the name change at Home Affairs. That became something that was really challenging.
Yeah, our child has probably, I mean, she has a very unusual name.
Yeah.
We decided to keep the name that her birth mother gave her. Our child was not abandoned. We were perfectly willing to accept an abandoned baby, but how we happened to be matched in the end was with a birth mother who had given our child her name, and then we put both of our names together, double-barreled as a surname. So I think one of the big challenges for us as same-sex couple is that we had a feminist principle that the child should carry both of our surnames together, and the look of an African first name, a kind of British and
so Lerato Gillespie Naidu.
Wow.
The first time,
but anyway,
well, the first time we heard that in a doctor's surgery, it was like, wow, that's
our daughter. Yeah.
She has grown up to really inhabit that name.
It took a while for us to get that through the Home Affairs process, but once it was through, it was fun.
Now, Dee, can you just briefly take us through the adoption process, and how can people who want to adopt get a hold of you and get in touch with you?
Well, I think the best thing is to get hold of the National Adoption Coalition of South Africa. We have a website and we have a call centre. My understanding is you're putting those numbers up and the website up, but the website is adoption.org.za. And we have a 24-hour call centre who will put you in touch with a social worker in your area, and you can then access that person and they will assist you in that process. And it's not just for people who want to adopt, it's also for people who are experiencing a crisis pregnancy, who don't know what to do, who are sitting there desperate. We can actually help them with a birth mother home and help them and counsel them through that process. So that is a 24-hour line and also obviously website where you can get somebody to help you. It is an incredibly rigorous process, which I think sometimes does tire parents out tremendously. But it's important that it is that process. These are very special children, and we need to make sure that we find the perfect parents for them. And so that's why it is so rigorous, and that's why we do take care. I think our frustration at the moment is that it is a good piece of legislation. It is a good process because it is rigorous. But unfortunately, it does appear that the Department of Social Development and the courts are not doing all in their power to actually streamline the process and to make sure that it happens as effectively and efficiently as possible. Essentially, whilst a child is waiting to be adopted, they're placed in a place of safety or in an institution, and that's never ideal. The big thing is to get a child into a family as quickly as possible so that they can connect with their mothers and their parents, and they can actually grow into a family as quickly as possible. If you delay the process, the child does suffer. And really what we want to do is really encourage the Department of Social Development to come on board and help us to really streamline that process as much as possible.
Thank you very much. We're well informed. And Kelly and Leanne, thanks for sharing your story.
Sure. Thanks.
Let's take a look at some of your tweets. The question